Welcome to this training video, which supports the delivery of the Year 8 Drinks and Drugs unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of 6 lessons, which have been planned to build on previous learning about drugs from Year 8, and which will be built on further in Years 9 and 10. This planned spiral over time aims to mimic the kinds of drugs which pupils might be exposed to as they're growing up, as it's important that content isn't delivered too late to be effective and useful to them. In Year 7s, pupils will have learnt about cigarettes and vaping as part of the My Body unit. In studying this unit in Year 8, pupils will focus on caffeine with a specific look at energy drinks, as well as prescription drugs and alcohol. The content on alcohol covers calculating the units of alcohol in drinks, as well as physical effects, social effects, and how to manage influence and pressure. This unit is then followed by one which centres on first aid and vaccinations. Going forwards into Year 9, pupils will then focus on illicit drugs and addiction and steroids. And as part of the Managing My Health unit in Year 10, pupils will also have lessons which build upon their prior knowledge of vapes, alcohol, and other drugs in an age-appropriate manner. The first lesson begins with a Do Now activity, which serves as a baseline of pupils' knowledge. In that, they're asked to list examples of legal drugs. There's no list of answers provided because this task is a baseline assessment, which you can keep and then come back to at the end of the unit to gauge pupils' knowledge and progress. You could ask pupils to share their ideas with the class, but if they're going to be making further annotations to their work based on what other pupils have suggested, it would be best to do so using a pen of a different colour. And then that way you can see really clearly which ideas they've come up with themselves and which ideas are from other pupils. We then have a scenario to read and discuss about a pupil who's tired and resorts to trying energy drinks to try to manage their tiredness. When you're discussing responses with pupils to this scenario, it's really worth listening carefully to their use of pronouns. There's no pronouns which have been used in this scenario as it's written down, and the name Lennox has been deliberately chosen to remain open to pupils' interpretation. So if some pupils start referring to Lennox as being male and others asking or commenting on Lennox being female, it might be worth posing the question as to why pupils have made these assumptions. Later in the lesson, pupils are asked to predict which drinks have been had the most or the least caffeine in them. If it's at all possible, having physical props are really, really helpful. So if you can have empty bottles or cups or teapots, that's always a really helpful visual to be able to use. Alternatively, you could also print these images to a large size and have the class then negotiate, after they've come up with their own sequences, what they think overall the correct answers should be. The answer slide is then animated to show the correct order, which also includes the 2 without any caffeine. When you're then having that conversation about whether they're surprised or what they think, it's useful to start to unpick their suggestions, to use the idea of there being 15 milligrams of caffeine in 100 grams of dairy milk chocolate as a point of comparison. So thinking about how much caffeine they get from chocolate as opposed to these drinks. And then also start thinking about how much caffeine they think might be considered to be a healthy amount to consume. And that then transitions into the next part of the lesson about recommendations. In Lesson 2, the Do Now activity actually tells pupils what the focus of the lesson is going to be, although it does require them to find the 9-letter word answer from this puzzle to do so. Ultimately, this task is just designed to get pupils thinking at the very start of the lesson. It's not solely about trying to find that 9-letter word. Pupils could write their lists of words on a post-it note or in their exercise books, depending on whether or not you want to keep the lists afterwards. The rules for this activity are fairly simple, so you can only use a letter as many times as it appears in the grid. For example, I couldn't say the word deed because there's only one D in the grid. Each word also needs to use the centre letter, so I couldn't use the word mini as an answer either because it's not using the E. I'd suggest giving pupils 2 or 3 minutes to create their lists of answers and then to ask each pupil for one answer as you're taking the register. It's a really good way of encouraging everyone to contribute at the start of the lesson. As you start to go further down the register, some pupils might have had all of their words shared by the time you reach them. So if you're going to continue this sort of thing in future with other Do Now activities, you might want to adjust the order in which you're asking pupils to try to make it as fair as possible. And it also helps to keep the pupils on their toes because they're not sure who's going to be asked next. The first activity after the title and the learning objectives is another baseline assessment. And this one helps to get a sense of what pupils are thinking about when they're thinking of medicines. This is also known as a draw and write task, which is literally, as the name suggests, pupils draw whatever it is that they're thinking of, and they can make annotations or comments next to the picture to help give some clarity about what they're trying to show in that picture. A stick figure is absolutely fine here. The important part of this is that the pupils are expressing their thoughts and their understanding as it stands right now. At the end of this lesson, once pupils have learned more about medicines, they can then come back to this baseline and use a pen of a different colour to make further drawings and annotations to show what they now understand and potentially to correct any errors or misconceptions they might have had before this lesson. The second lesson also includes a career spotlight on the role of pharmacists. So at this point in the lesson, you might choose to read through and discuss the job profile handout to help pupils to understand the qualifications required and the potential career pathways, or you could watch the video profile and hear firsthand from a pharmacist about what she loves about her job. This helps to meet Gatsby Benchmark 4, which focuses on linking curriculum learning to careers. The last part of Lesson 2 is an opportunity for pupils to get creative in demonstrating their understanding of information related to prescriptions and medicines. Pupils can choose between creating an Instagram post or a storyboard for a TikTok video to share key information on behalf of the NHS to inform the public about either the costs of prescription drugs or how to responsibly use prescription drugs. Lesson 3 then is the start of a series of lessons focusing on another commonly easily accessible legal drug, which is alcohol. This task is designed as another baseline activity which will stretch out over the 4 lessons which look at alcohol, and they'll revisit it at the end of each of those lessons and progressively add more information to show their learning journey. As with other baseline tasks, it's best that the initial part of this is done in silence, and then pupils are only writing down their own initial understanding and ideas. It's also important to have a look at what pupils have written in these baseline activities and to try to provide accurate information in response to any questions or misunderstandings they might have. It's obviously more difficult to do that if the baseline only relates to the content of one lesson, but ideally you would have a look at this work that is completed on this sheet after lesson 3 to ensure that you can then adapt the content of the following 3 lessons as needed to address any issues that you've seen. Lesson 3 as a whole focuses on units in alcohol to try to help pupils to be able to recognise that different drinks have different amounts of alcohol in them. This activity requires pupils to predict the amount of alcohol in each drink. So pupils will create their list, they'll rank them in order from having the least alcohol to the most alcohol, and then you can have a conversation discussing the various ideas, and then you'll go through the process of showing how to calculate the amount of ethanol or pure alcohol in each of those drinks. A key piece of information that it's worth mentioning here is that on average it takes the body about an hour to process 1 unit of alcohol. So for example, a 3-unit pint of beer would take about 3 hours to break down. This means you can still have alcohol in your system the day after drinking, depending on how much it was you consumed. Now, it's all well and good that pupils know what a unit is and know how to calculate them and know what the NHS guidance says, but the part of the lesson which really becomes memorable and makes all that learning stick is actually having pupils calculate the number of units in these real drinks. So in the past, I have collected empty bottles and used them as props for an activity to do this in the classroom. So pupils need to use the volume and the strength information which is listed on the bottle to calculate the number of units in the whole bottle. And then they contextualize that against the NHS guidance. So, for example, if the small bottle of Stella Artois in the picture here has 1.3 units in it, then a person would be able to drink roughly 11 of these bottles in a week and still fit within the NHS guidance. Most of the bottles will have a little icon which shows the number of units in the bottle. So you want to make sure that you put a sticker over that to hide that answer before conducting the activity. And if you're going to be using glass bottles, It's also important that pupils are advised of appropriate behaviour and health and safety to make sure that they're safe whilst doing this task. Now, you might not be able to gather enough bottles, or you might not want to have them in your classroom for whatever reason. So there's also an alternative version which you could use, having these handouts instead. The handouts have a picture of the bottle, information about the volume and strength, and pupils can then still complete the activity in the same way. It's important that you carry out your own calculations before the lesson so that when it comes time to discuss the answers afterwards, you will know if any mistakes have been made. And that also then helps you to hopefully build your confidence in understanding the process of how to calculate units. And in turn, that means you should be able to explain that process more clearly. Lesson 4 focuses on the physical impact of drinking alcohol. Pupils have a diagram to label to show the short-term and long-term effects they're aware of, and then there's examples of answers listed in the slides. And then we come to this worksheet where pupils are asked to use the Diamond 9 to decide which of these examples of potential long-term effects might have the greatest impact on someone's attitude towards drinking alcohol. So in the example here, we've got a pupil who has suggested that they think that potential infertility might be most likely to stop people from drinking, and they're saying that that's because those people might want children. At the other end of the scale, this pupil has said that they don't think insomnia is particularly worrying or concerning. Now, the initial ranking within the Diamond 9 itself isn't so much the focus here, because it's really easy for students to just write a few words in each box without thinking at all, and let alone thinking about where they're going to rank it in what order. So you can see here on the example the justifications for the top and bottom selections, and asking pupils to write this really helps them to think more in greater detail about the reasons behind their decisions. The justifications don't have to be very long, but the benefit is it's not just about them thinking in greater depth, but it also then prepares them for the subsequent discussion when you seek to compare responses. And you would do that using this grid. So as discussed in training videos for other units, it's useful to seek feedback from pupils to get a sense of how other people have responded. An easy way to do that is to read out each of the 9 responses in turn and to ask pupils to raise their hands if they're ranked in the top 3. And then you do it again for the bottom 3. So here you can see, after I've asked the class how many ranked changes in mood in their top 3, they've raised their hands, and there's 2 answers, so I've written that in green. And then 5 for depression and anxiety, and so on for all of those. And then going back again, this time 6 of them have ranked changes in mood at the bottom, and so on and so forth. This then helps to open up conversations about the reasons for placements on the grid, and you can focus on examples with a clear difference in responses. So in this case, pupils tend to believe that changes in mood wouldn't really make an impact on someone's attitude to consuming alcohol, so then you could target questions about why that might be. There's another task in this lesson which can be adapted based on what's most appropriate for your class and your context. The myth-busting activity has been designed to have a simple visual difference to show whether pupils believe each statement is true or whether they believe it's false. You can tweak the activity, so instead it runs as a continuum. So you would designate one side of the classroom as being totally agree, and the opposite side as totally disagree, and pupils then have to stand along this imaginary line to show the extent to which they're agreeing or disagreeing with each statement. If you're going to go with that option, it's important to try to encourage pupils to think independently about where they're going to stand, and randomly selecting some pupils to give verbal justifications to support their position, and that will hopefully discourage groupthink and then just following other people in the class as well. There's also a worksheet version of this activity which you could use. So pupils read each of the statements, think about whether they think it's true or false, and they write that in the blank column, as well as why they believe or disbelieve that statement, and then the correct answers can then be written in the second column. At the end of lesson 4, there's an opportunity for pupils to anonymously ask questions or to make comments. It's important that each pupil in the class write something down at this time to ensure that any questions which are written are truly anonymous. If pupils don't want to ask a question or write down anything else, they could instead be asked to write down their favourite flavour of ice cream or to tell you a joke or some other topic. Writing anonymous questions can help to take away a pupil's potential anxieties about asking a question to your face, but that's not to say that they don't still want a personal response. So to address this, it can be really helpful to ask pupils to indicate whether they would be happy with a response to the whole class, which would then maintain the confidentiality about who wrote the question, whether they'd like a one-to-one response, which would require the pupil to include their name, or whether it's just a comment for your information. After the lesson, make sure that you have a read through of all of the statements and questions, filter them out from any of the other submissions that pupils have given you, and then start to plan what your response to those questions are going to be, making sure that they're age and stage appropriate. You also then need to ensure that you've made time in the following lesson to be able to share those answers as appropriate. Now, when talking about alcohol, we often discuss its physical effects, but we don't always provide sufficient time to discuss the potential social consequences of drinking, such as the way that other people might react to drunken behaviour or how it might impact on a relationship. So lesson 5 includes an activity which involves 5 pupils acting out a role play which is set at a party. You would need to select one of the 5 pupils to be the host, who isn't drinking alcohol and who tries to interact with the other guests at the party. Each of the other 4 pupils would then be given one of the guest cards on these party time handouts, and these outline the behaviours that they will need to exhibit after you prompt them to have a hypothetical drink. You might have a bell or a buzzer, or you could just call out the word drink. Pupils start the role play by acting as they think that people might normally do at a party, and then after your first prompt, the 4 drinking guests pretend to have an alcoholic drink and then act out their first behaviours, whilst the non-drinking host tries to interact and manage behaviour as they might need to if that was a real-life situation. The rest of the pupils in the audience are watching and trying to identify each of the actions that are being shown as the party continues. When the pupils have then acted out their 5th action, you then end the party and ask the audience to identify how the guests had behaved. They may or may not start to notice that each of the guests actually have a recurring theme to their actions. So as you can see from the handout here, the behaviours shown by guest 1 are all focused on how they were talking and the changes in their speech. It's important to have a conversation about how other people might have been affected by what had happened. So asking the audience how they might imagine the host may have felt at that time with all those people acting rather oddly. Asking them if they think that anyone was potentially at risk of hurting themselves or hurting someone else, or whether any of the actions might potentially lead to regret or other consequences in the days and weeks after the party. Building on from that party activity, there's another task in lesson 5 which asks pupils to consider the extent to which different people are affected by a person's actions when drinking. The idea is that pupils will think about how each action might affect that individual, but also how they can affect the individual's friends and families, and then anyone else who might come into the contact with that individual. There's 10 boxes which can be used as a scale there, and you can get pupils to think about the different proportions when they're trying to compare those impacts. There's also space in the final column so that pupils can write a comment to explain their ideas. So to show how this can work, I've coloured the key at the bottom here. So pink is going to refer to the extent to which the individual is affected, blue for family and friends, and then green for everyone else. If we take the first example about being more talkative after drinking, I'm going to say that the individual is probably affected more than the others. They might start to say too much, they might reveal some secrets or make some inappropriate comments. And then I've split the rest of the space evenly between the friends and family and also the other people. So they might get offended by what's going on, or they might get tired of hearing the person blabbering on. And then I've added my brief comment in the final column there to show my thinking. As another example, if we were to look at vomiting at the bottom of the list, I'm going to suggest that actually maybe there's less of an impact for the individual person themselves. So it's not a nice thing, but I'm going to propose the idea that there's a greater impact or effect on the friends and the family and other people who might have to deal with cleaning up a mess or might have to listen to those sounds. They might not even gone out or been drinking themselves, and they're still having to deal with this as an effect. There's no clear right or wrong answers to this task, so this is all about trying to encourage individual pupils to interpret it and then to come up with reasons behind their suggestions. This is why it's really important to have a discussion after the task is finished, so that you're sharing a wide range of views and helping pupils to understand that what they might think, or if they think something might only affect themselves, that actually it could be interpreted by other people as having a wider impact. The final lesson in this unit starts with a do now activity about the reasons why people might drink alcohol. In theory, any appropriate idea is acceptable here, which is why there's no included list of answers. So pupils might say that someone drinks to relax and unwind, because they're socializing, or to manage stress, or something like that. Immediately after this slide, there's a world of work profile about the job of a sommelier who tastes wine and helps customers to decide which wines they might like with their meals at a restaurant. So in that example, we've got a person who drinks alcohol as part of their job. The main focus of the lesson is about managing influence and pressure. So if pupils don't identify already that idea of peer pressure or social expectations leading to people to drink alcohol, then it's worth raising that as another answer as well. Later in the lesson, there's also some data which relates to a survey of young people about their understanding of why other people their age might drink alcohol, which nicely links back to this starter activity. The last main activity in this lesson is a consequence tree, which is related to a scenario where the pupils go to a party and they're given a cup with an unknown drink in it. The first step in completing this consequence tree is to think of the different ways in which we might be able to avoid having that drink, given that we don't know what's in it, and we're going to write those on the main branches of the tree. So I'm going to put me at the bottom because this is about me being in this situation, and I'm going to come up with 3 scenarios here. So I've got spill the drink accidentally, I've got pretend to drink it and nurse the drink and then leave it on a table somewhere, or just decline it and say that you don't want it. You could ask the pupils to come up with their own 3 actions, or you can agree 3 as a class, or you can tell them 1 and give them some flexibility in other ones. It's ultimately up to you. Now we're going to build on that, and we're going to think about what the potential consequences of each of these 3 actions might be by drawing some smaller branches. So I'm going to focus on the spilling the drink option as an example here. So a consequence, if I was to accidentally, in inverted commas, spill the drink, might be that Jamie gets annoyed that I've made a mess. Alternatively, Jamie might go and get me another drink, which kind of puts me back to square one. My attempt hasn't worked at all. Or it might give me a chance to go and get my own drink. And then I can think further consequences down the line as well. So if I can pour my own drink, then I might know, presumably, what I'm drinking, because I can check it. I can make sure that I know whether it's alcoholic or non-alcoholic. I can be aware of the fact that nothing else has been added to it. Also, as a consequence, I might feel happier. I might feel more safe. And if you've got time, you can add even more consequences. So I can build on the fact that I know what I'm drinking. I can pretend that it's alcohol. So if I'm not wanting to drink alcohol, but I feel that there's some social pressure, I can pretend that I'm drinking vodka when actually it's water. In terms of me feeling happier and more safe, a consequence of that, I'm presumably going to have a bit of a better time at the party. So we've got ideas here of building up loads of consequences of each of the actions. So this is only one example, but then you do that for the other branches as well. And ultimately, you're trying to build this tree of possibilities. It's important that each of these potential outcomes is something that could actually happen, but they don't have to be all positive. So I could say that Jamie getting annoyed at me making a mess leads to him then shouting at me and I get kicked out of the party. As much as that's a negative outcome, it's a potential possibility that should be addressed as well. When you've completed the tree and you've come up with all these ideas, this then becomes the basis of a discussion, and you're trying to get the pupils to evaluate each of these actions. So based on all of the possible outcomes, which of these has the most positive overall outcomes? Which of these 3 options is kind of the best thing to do? Because I've come up with this list of all these things that could happen, but what should I do? What is it that in theory is going to have a net positive outcome if I don't want to drink what Jamie's given me. After pupils have kind of identified what the should action is, then you can flip it slightly and say to a pupil, what do you think someone in that situation would be most likely to do? Now, it's important to distance that. So it's not saying, what would you do in that situation? Because we don't want pupils to feel under pressure. They're not necessarily going to be likely to say the honest answer because they might feel like they have to conform. So if you anonymize it, distance it by saying, what do you think someone in that situation would be likely to do, then they'll be more likely to give you an accurate answer. Because it's all well and good that we know what we can do and we know what the potential outcomes are, but we need to think about what people are more likely to do. And if it's not what they should do, what is the reason that someone is not actively going to do what they know is in their best interests? If you're looking for additional information to support your delivery of these lessons, you may find the 4 organisations listed here quite helpful. Alcohol Change UK is a charity which offers a great deal of information and research about alcohol consumption and has advice on managing drinking. DrinkAware is another charity which is focused on alcohol awareness. They have a shop from which you can order unit measuring cups and unit calculator wheels, which could be really useful and practical to use in your lessons. The online shop also has a number of free downloadable resource packs, which could supplement the content within these lessons. Frank is a government website which provides information on a range of different drugs, both legal and illegal. It's a helpful resource for accessing reliable information about the appearance, effects, and laws related to different drugs. And finally, the Talk About Trust, which was formerly known as the Alcohol Education Trust. They have resources for use in schools, but also a range of articles which can be shared with parents and carers to help in supporting further discussions beyond the classroom.